AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. And today we are joined by the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. That's Patrick Coolican, as we'll be talking about some news and columns that they've been working on over at the Reformer. As today we'll be talking about Governor Tim Walz signing the Uber-Lyft bill, as that has now become official. We'll also be talking about Patrick's column on how the filibuster came to Minnesota during the last session, as well as teacher licensing in Minnesota, and how a program that was originally supposed to help diversify our teaching workforce has maybe not necessarily done that job. So lots to get to today. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about your column about the filibuster coming to Minnesota, because as you write, the filibuster, or at least some form of it, has officially come to Minnesota. As Senate DFLers say, two debates on some relatively minor adjustments back during the session, minor adjustments they were trying to make to cannabis legalization, went for a total of 12 hours. That will be 12 hours debating just some minor adjustments to cannabis legalization. DFL also posted a video showing GOP senators talking about cheeseburgers when they were trying to debate some motions on the Judiciary Committee. And as you write, this is a rare column in which you do not necessarily afflict blame to people, but say everyone should share the blame for what marked the end of the last legislative session. So I'm curious for your thoughts. Who should be kind of sharing the blame for what happened for that very racious end to the last legislative session?
Yeah, I don't really think that anybody's necessarily really at fault here. I mean, we have a polarized country, we have a polarized state. The two parties have sorted ideologically. We have a right of center party and a left of center party, and so it makes sense that you would have sharp disagreements, and people feel as if the stakes are so high that they must stop the other side from enacting their legislative agenda, or if you're a Democrat, we have to use every opportunity we have with this trifecta to pass what we want. And so I don't think necessarily that it's anybody's fault. To me, it just makes sense given the situation, which is different than in the past when you had the two parties were more ideologically diverse, and so you had more bipartisan coalitions, and those days are past. And I don't know that it does a whole lot of good to pine for that, because it's not happening, at least at this moment. And so you wind up in a situation where the rules being pretty permissive with respect to with amendments. You can offer an almost unlimited number of amendments and time to debate. That may have worked in the past when the minority and the majority maybe would negotiate on, okay, we're not going to go too long on this one, and so we'll make sure that give you guys a chance, and then you're going to let us, you're going to make sure that we have a chance to say our piece and so forth. We're now in a situation where those permissive rules can be used to really be a good delay tactic. In this case, it's the Republicans, but there's certainly it could just as easily be Democrats in the minority. We've seen in the state it swing back and forth, and so the minority in this case, they did seem to take extra time on a lot of these debates. But by the same token, the Democrats, they had all session, and so I'm not really all that sympathetic to complaints of filibustering when you had all session and you didn't, and you're still here on the final weekend and you haven't passed your bills. Furthermore, the Senate didn't do much at all on the final Saturday of session because one of the DFL members, Senator Omar Fatah, was negotiating the Uber-Lyft bill, and he was using his considerable leverage to make sure nothing else happened until that bill got done. So nobody's at fault, everybody's at fault, and the question now is, what do you do? Because it really is important, I think, that democratically elected governing coalitions be entitled to pass their agenda. That's what the voters sent them to do, and they should be allowed to do it. The minority should be able to say their piece, and we should respect the right of the minority to make their arguments to the voters in preparation for the next election. But I think to have a functional functioning government. Uh, in contrast to the United States Congress and especially the U.S. Senate, where nothing can happen without supermajority, generally speaking, and I think that's just a terrible way to try to govern. I don't think we want that here in Minnesota. So the question is, what do you do to make sure that we respect the rights of the minority, say their piece, while also allowing the democratically elected majority to pass the bills that they want to pass?
Well, what do you make of DFLers possibly mulling changes that could, well, limit the timing on debates? Is this something that could, well, possibly lead to, well, actually having more governance, as you were kind of talking about, rather than just having endless debate? Because I like what you brought up, too, when you have endless debate. It's very tough for media and even the general public to kind of follow what's going on, where if you were to have, well, quicker, I guess, more concise debate, it would be a lot easier to kind of follow what's happening at the Capitol.
Yeah, I think it was the final Wednesday of the session. The Senate met all night into Thursday morning, and I mean that's not unusual at the end of session, and it's impossible for the public, for the media, for the interest groups, for everybody who has a stake in this process. It's impossible for them to watch, and so it's not a good idea to be meeting in the middle of the night. It's terrible for the staff, for the people who make sure that the Capitol is clean and safe. So that's another reason why I think it's a decent idea to have some ground rules about the length of debate. I got some pushback from a Republican legislator today who says, well, then you're going to have to limit the number of amendments. And, the DFL tried to do this in 2009 and 10. And then when the Republicans came back in 10 and won the majority, they took the rules out and went back to the kind of Wild West system. I refuse to believe that this is the only system available to us. This kind of anything goes, free for all, and there's lots of other models. Both the United States House, although they do sharply limit amendments, and I think that would be a bad thing. And then there's all kinds of there's legislative chambers across the country with different models. We apparently are on the one end, the far end of the spectrum, as far as being a lot more of a kind of a free for all. We also have a big legislature. The House itself is quite large, and so if everybody wants to talk, it's going to take a long time. But I just think that there's surely a way to create some very reasonable rules around how much debate we're going to have, so that we don't have 12 and 14-hour debates. And let's be clear, nobody's mind is being changed by these debates. Yeah. I mean, it's very, very rare that somebody's mind would be changed. And even if their mind was changed, the pressure on them to vote with their caucus is such that it's highly unlikely. So it's a lot of it's a sort of theater, and sometimes it's fun theater, but a lot of times it's not. It's just a waste of everyone's time. And then, of course, it also is it's an impediment to the, again, democratically elected majority from enacting their agenda. And what I like about the majority being able to pass their agenda, unlike the U.S. Senate, for instance, is that then there's accountability. You pass your agenda, your ideas worked, then you can take that to the voters. Your ideas didn't work, then the voters know, okay, that was your agenda, your policies, you passed them, they didn't work, and now I'm going to vote the other way. But when in a system where, especially with the U.S. Senate, where everybody can just point fingers, and that inaction is sort of almost always the eventual reality of what's going on, then everybody can just point fingers and nobody's accountable for anything.
Reading more about Patrick's column, The Filibuster Comes to Minnesota, over at minnesotareformer.com, minnesotareformer.com. I want to talk about some other news stories that have been around today, and One of those includes Governor Tim Walz signing the rideshare bill that will be taking effect later on, as this is a bill that will help boost the pay of Uber and Lyft drivers throughout Minnesota and Minneapolis, as DFL leaders anticipate about a 20% pay increase for drivers. Walz was able to sign that bill surrounded by drivers and lawmakers who helped negotiate that deal with the city of Minneapolis. So, at least with this signing ceremony, at least seems like everyone is relatively happy with this bill. All of the stakeholders, whether it's the legislators who were debating it or Uber drivers themselves, and well, even the companies themselves seem to be relatively happy with the situation. Anything else we should note from the signing ceremony that occurred earlier today?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't following it real closely, but I mean, I would say that the city council of Minneapolis, I mean, on the one hand, they say they forced the issue, although I think Senator Omar Fatah was always going to be right there pushing this issue. He got a bill passed last session that was vetoed. It was Governor Tim Walz's only veto of his entire tenure because he thought the minimum pay rates were too high and would create would dampen demand and maybe even force the companies to leave. So the city council, I guess, can take some pride in the fact that they forced the issue, but on the other hand, they were preempted. So it's been a mark of pride in Minneapolis that has had a higher minimum wage and some tougher labor standards, some pro-worker labor ordinances, because in their view, the state was not acting, and so the city took it up. Well, now you have the situation where the state legislature has preempted the Minneapolis City Council. I know some members of the city council were pretty upset with that as a precedent. So I think it's been an interesting interplay between the city council and the legislature, and some of the members of both, and how this is all played out. But yeah, it was a fascinating episode in Minnesota politics and policy, and I think generally people are happy that the companies are staying here. The drivers are going to make more money, theoretically anyway. We'll have to see how it plays out. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it is implemented and enforced, and to see if will rates go up, and if rates go up, will that affect folks of modest means who use the services to go to grocery shopping or doctor's appointments, or to get home from the bar. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But I think for now, I think a lot of DFL officials are quite pleased that they avoided some kind of a confrontation that would have led the companies to leave on July 1st, when the Minneapolis City Council ordinance was set to take effect.
I want to go back up to what you were just talking about with preemption, because that is an interesting aspect. Because normally, when we talk about preemption, where state legislatures override whatever the local city council passes, normally that's been the case where you have a Democratic-controlled local city and then a Republican state legislature. Obviously, this was a different scenario where you had a Democratic-controlled legislature overriding a Democratic-controlled city council, which I would understand the frustration and possibly some of the fear from city council members, thinking, well, what's to stop Republicans from then turning around and doing this if they get the majority, saying, well, look at what the DFL did back in 2024 when they were able to override what we were able to pass. Now Republicans have a precedent to go by. So I could certainly see their end of the argument as to why they'd be a little nervous about what happened, simply because of now Republicans could possibly use this in the future.
Yeah, the Republican legislature in 2017, 2018 passed a number of bills, and they put them into budget bills. So Governor Mark Dayton, the DFL governor at the time, was forced to sign them. Like, I think the plastic bag ban, for instance, in Minneapolis got overturned because of the legislative preemption. And so, yeah, I think that, and I think DFL legislators, especially the Minneapolis delegation, they were not eager to do this, but they felt like they were really left with no choice. Because that Minneapolis ordinance was a non-starter for the companies, and they really just did not want the companies to leave. So yeah, I think that's the problem here for Minneapolis City Council, is that while they got a policy win, they also have to stomach this preemption aspect of it.
And one more piece of news to talk about, and this is an article you guys worked on over the weekend, and it's titled An Aspiring Teacher Story and How the Minnesota Licensing System Prevents Diversity of the Teacher Corps in Minnesota. And basically this stems from a teacher in North Minneapolis, a PE teacher, who is trying to teach at a school in North Minneapolis, an elementary school called Hall STEM Academy. But she has been running into trouble with what Minnesota has as a tiered licensing system, where basically this means a Tier 1 license is designed for people who haven't completed a traditional preparation program, while Tier 2 licenses are now limited to teachers enrolled in a teacher preparation program or who have a master's degree in the field in which they teach. This is basically designed to allow more teachers into the Corps without having that full teaching degree. But one of the issues is that you have to usually reapply for these types of licenses from year to year, and that can be a detriment to people who are trying to go into the profession when they don't necessarily have that job stability. So let's talk about this. What has been the issue with Minnesota's tiered system and some of the problems that we've run into unintentionally? Because this was something that was passed a few years ago that was designed to, well, diversify our teaching corps, but as was written, it's been kind of some mixed results in terms of whether that's really been the case.
Yeah, I think there's a tension here between making sure that we have qualified, properly trained, and licensed teachers on the one hand, and on the other hand, wanting to make sure that the barriers to getting into the profession aren't too high, because those barriers are especially tough on lower income folks and BIPOC folks. And we have a real problem with a teacher corps in Minnesota that is not sufficiently diverse. I think it's traditionally like 5% of the teacher corps are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, whereas the student population is approaching something like 40% of non-white students. And there's all kinds of good evidence that Black students with a Black teacher before a certain grade level, really early on, is really influential and helpful and effective, and for a long time. The benefits are long term, and it's also true for white students. They also benefit from having a Black or Indigenous or another person of color as a teacher. So you got those two things there, and how do we balance those? And the legislature in recent years, after the Republicans had wanted to make it easier to get licensed, the Democrats in control of the legislature have wanted to make it harder. I'm pretty sure that's at the urging of the teachers union. But it's, there are obviously benefits to making sure that our teacher corps are properly trained. On the other hand, it does make it more difficult when you put up those barriers to getting the best license. And so that's the tension that this story explores. I think Melissa did a really good job. I should note that, and unfortunately I just realized that we didn't put that in the story, but it originally ran in a nice little nonprofit publication called Minneapolis Schools Voices, and we republished it with their permission. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Absolutely. And you can read more about this article over at minnesotareformer.com. minnesotareformer.com is it's worth diving into this a little bit more to talk about, or to at least understand that there's more to it than just trying to make it easier or harder to become a teacher. It's much more complicated than that, and encourage you to check that out, minnesotareformer.com. We are just about out of time, unfortunately, though, as we have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Again, the website one more time, minnesotareformer.com, for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.